Welcome, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming this evening to listen to our research, including my topic on mindful self-compassion. This is a pilot model for coaching male business leaders. And what I'd like us to do is just to start with 3 deep breaths, because this was a practice I used throughout. So if you can just with me, take 3 deep breaths. I was particularly interested in mindful self-compassion because self-compassion has really helped me in my own journey with mindfulness. I work in business, so I often work with a lot of male business leaders, and I've been bringing mindfulness in for a while, and I was just really curious, could self-compassion help men? So could we apply mindful self-compassion to business coaching for men in small and medium-sized enterprises? Often they don't have personnel departments, they're small organizations, so they may not have expertise. And it's a non-clinical setting, so I had to be aware of that. And would this help them develop awareness and presence, wiser insights, personal and in business? Would it make a difference to their wellness and resilience? I was very aware of the men's health statistics. I mean, they speak for themselves. And I just wondered if this work could make a difference for men that were suffering from stress at work. So I was also interested in the tender yin and fierce compassion, expressions of compassion. I wondered if they were significant to male business leaders. And then I was also curious about the skills and competencies that a coach would need. So the study was bringing together self-compassion, fierce and tender compassion, expressions, and business leadership coaching in the study. And I wanted to bridge theory with practice safely and ethically into business. That was really key, being safe and ethical. And I wanted to ground the concepts, create reflective spaces, and then just identify any benefits of wellness and resilience. I didn't have a lot of time because it was the end of my 5 years. So I worked with 2 men that I'd already worked with in business, which evidence talks about there is usually better to have a prior relationship because of the level of work. You're working with suffering and there's a vulnerability there. And I needed to design an some engaging coaching sessions to put the methods into context. And I wanted to record the session insights because I needed to be aware of what's going on in each session so I could feed that into the next session and then the final interview and then analyze the findings. I took a social constructive worldview because it was about the participants, their meaning, their perspectives and experiences, but also it was I needed pragmatism paradigm because it was about solving problems, being real world orientated. And it was a pilot, so I needed to customize the approach. I did a broad literature review. There wasn't a lot of research in this area, so I was bridging lots of different themes, and that was quite complicated. But I needed that for a well-informed, robust approach. The gaps I mitigated with grey literature, industry reports, and I did additional training with Christian Neff and Chris Germer on fierce compassion and shame, online and face-to-face. I had correspondence with Dr. Steve Hickman from the US MSc Mindfulness Compassion Organization and Rick Hansen. And they gave me some anecdotal sort of evidence about men, but they couldn't point to any research. And then I did an interview with Shodan as well. The limitations were the time frame, financial and limited human resources. I was using the research approach. I was using my coaching, an INL coach and HeartMath coach, the MA and MSc mindfulness practices. I was drawing from them. And I found a model of coaching for self-compassion that I would definitely say look at if anyone's interested in this area. It was really, really good. And it referred and used Gilbert's 3 systems of emotions model, which I'd been using in my coaching work as well. I combined that with Rick Hanson's approach to the needs we have to be satisfied, safe and connected. So that was something I was quite familiar with. And the 2 qualitative data collection methods for validity and reliability, one was the online reflective feedback form. And we used a QR code for that because, again, it was a business setting. And then the final face-to-face interview. I won't get lost in this, it's quite complicated, but this shows you the coaching pilot design. I'd already done some research from a professional inquiry. Professional inquiry is really useful with 25 men. And then with the literature review, there were 9 key themes. We used the self-compassion scale, but we didn't report on that. That was to build client awareness. We did an online introduction session to talk about backdraft and safety. And then the sessions were face-to-face. I was really keen to do them face-to-face because it was a pilot study. And then we did the final interview face-to-face as well. So the key themes were compassion and self-compassion. Compassion can be quite complex, and how did it fit with self-compassion? Fears and tender expressions, safety and fears of compassion, compassionate leadership in business, business leadership coaching, self-criticism, communication, language, gender, culture, and the impact of socialization and wellness and resilience. This is an example of the on the reflection online form that was used. Really, really simple, you know, awareness, mindfulness, common humanity and suffering, and ability to be kind to yourself. So it was organized into these 3 areas, again, which was a really helpful reflective tool for the participant and for myself as the coach. So the coaching tools and practices included the 3 elements. And we explored fierce and tender compassion. I looked at Gardner's multiple intelligence theories because it was a complicated subject matter. So I used lots of different tools. Images, language, words, and some of the words that were being used by Rick Hanson, warm-hearted, empathy, a bit more words that people were probably a little bit more familiar with. The practices were simple and repeated, and they were empowering tools. The approach was a reflective space, and I did the mindfulness poetry with Faye, and that really, really helped me get into that kind of mindset. Ethics and self-care were just critical in the informed consent, the contract, coaching contract, and we discussed it at every session. Psychological safety is key. And we looked at the fears of compassion as well, as it was going to be in a non-clinical setting, and it was a short pilot. Coaching questions were mindful and gentler, less goal-orientated. A lot of coaching in the business world tends to be very sharp and, you know, smart, and we took more of an approach of the mindful inquiry techniques that we learn in the MSc training and in the Mindfulness Association, and I gained a lot of that from the tutors when I listened to them as well. The 3 core coaching tools were the 7 spacious breaths that I got to know in the MA wisdom practice, but we do that in some of the practices. That sort of bookended the start and the finish of the session. Then there was a growing compassionate self, which was working with the suffering and difficulty, and that was an adaptation of a few practices. And then the taking in the good practice, similar to heal. And Rick Hanson has just done a paper on that, again, worth looking at, learning to learn from positive experiences to build a psychological resource to deal with the suffering. So you can't just ask people to deal with suffering, they've got to have some resource to look at the suffering. And the additional practices were an emotional grid, a heart math tool, because I was getting the men to talk about their emotions, and not everybody knows about emotions and where they sit. You know, are they depleting and stressful? Are they resilient ones that can support resilience, like joy, peace, contentment? Soles of the feet practice, to ground when people were stressed. Boundaries practice, which I created, and some coaching cards that were using the words associated with tender and fierce compassion. So the findings, just check on time. Okay. The online reporting was really useful, and what I did is I kind of created this little infographic. So these are pseudonyms. So for Chris, he called it a self-acceptance mindset, and it was about his worthiness of being kind to himself. He was very, he became more aware of, he deflected his own suffering to help others. There's always somebody else worse off. I'll go and help them. So he was denying and suppressing his own suffering. He became aware of that. And this, he called it self-compassion blindness. You know, he had this barrier because he was a carer. But as we went through the practices and the sessions, he was starting to get some foundational tools to help him for his work and home, and he called it surprisingly enjoyable, which I thought was quite funny. Nathan did a reflection after the first session. He worked in IT. He was very aware of his distractions and expectations of other people from his IT. He was conscious he would sometimes have a narrow focus because of his technical training, and it was about coming back and looking at the bigger picture and zooming out. He was a people pleaser and had issues with boundaries. He became more aware of his body, and he became more aware of his self-critic. And then when he was stressed, he would be aware that his habits would start to creep back. But he did use one of the practices to calm the self-critic, which was the growing the compassionate self. He'd speak the words to himself. So the findings, we've got a potential model for coaching mindful self-compassion to leaders, suggesting this could be a self-compassion mindset, simple core breathing practices, the reflection feedback, maintain motivation, and the taking into the good, hold on a second, move this, taking in the good, the Rick Hanson's practice brought a sense of achievement. One of the things Chris said, he wasn't good at congratulating himself. He will be moving on to the next thing. So very critical, but he learned how to really relish the good and build those psychological resources. The soften, soothe and allow, like the compassion break, this practice to hold suffering, again, was a help with the theory to practice barrier. And from Nathan, he became more aware of how everything was connecting in his body and how he was feeling and his emotions, not just his thoughts. So there's the signs that this taking in the good state, so turning the states into traits process was impacting them both for self-compassion, self-acceptance, and the worthiness of success. And one of the words that Chris used was, it's all about love, and he meant self-love. So there was evidence that this was happening in their daily lives, boundaries to manage stress. You know, Nathan was talking about getting people to turn the technology off in meetings. So there was more presence. He was more aware. Chris was again accepting his achievements, and trying not to avoid his suffering, and be more aware of his negativity. Nathan was more present in his body, rather than reacting to situations. He would, what he said, zooming in and zooming out, you know, coming out and taking some time and looking at other people rather than getting sort of ruminating and thinking of himself. This paper by Torzewski, I can never say these words, sorry, Torzewski, he talks about that this should be taught in business schools, and he talks about it as self-leading, linked to health and job satisfaction in this VUCA world that's volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, that managers and leaders are working in. So the benefits for Chris, it was about new habits, confidence in practice, from more about being than doing. For Nathan, it was about boundaries, the courage to ask for help. He didn't have to do it all himself, thinking about himself first so he could do more, less rumination, And both of them talked about self-harm through overworking, which was kind of worrying if we look at the men's health stats. So they were learning about self-care. So it's a promising gender-specific lens. The Men's Health Forum, who have been looking at this, and MPs have just done an inquiry last year and this year, and I've fed some of the data into that. Connecting coaching combined with the breathing is connecting mind, body, and emotions. And there's some research about the men's brains is a little bit different in emotional literacy. It's debatable, is this socialization, but this inclination towards action being agentic, and the fact that they favor metaphor to maintain a self of strength, safety, strength, and masculinity. And these were some of the expressions that were picked up. And this was a way, as a coach, you could say, how are we going to stop spinning the plates? We didn't need to go into the detail. We could use that as a way in. And there is, again, talk about that emotional therapy may unintentionally favor women and disadvantage some men. Again, this is not conclusive. Maybe coaching's a halfway. An example of a diagram I put together. And another one, the language around fierce compassion is probably, I would say, a bit more acceptable in a business environment. Bravery, strength, courage, hope. So that was almost like a way in for the men. And then we would go to the yin. But when we got to the yin, we kind of realized that perhaps they weren't as great at the yang, but it was a way in. It was like a door to get them talking and more familiar, obviously, each. And this is something that kind of really worked for both of them. So the skills of a coach, again, I'm conscious of time, but these are the kind of skills that came back. So they speak for themselves, but the compassion, encouragement, safety, communication, and tools for a toolkit. The competencies, I would say, cultivating trust, safety, and compassion, space. Because the participants talking about suffering in a short time, relatively short time, there needs to be a good relationship and a balance between empathic understanding and motivation challenge. This is executive kind of level coaching. And then what I think that is key to the emergence of the compassion itself. So the coach is quite key in that, the compassionate, holding compassion, but staying in the window of tolerance, but also understanding a business environment, understanding the leader's readiness, pacing the sessions. And the big thing I found was deciding which practice to use. It might feel like, oh, they kind of need to relish this experience, but then being mindful and conscious and aware, you would actually realize we perhaps needed to look at the suffering behind it. So that was key. Assume that, no formal education. A lot of people in business may be entrepreneurial. So it's making sure that it's sort of individualistic learning. And there was the online feedback really, really worked because it created a mindful, structured business-like process where the participant notices, reflects, and plans. So there's some safety there before sharing it with the compassionate human, the coach. So just to finish up, one of the big blocks I would say was as we were developing self-kindness, they were becoming more aware and present, but that triggered self-criticism, especially during stressful situations. But they both started to use some of the tools. The not feeling worthy was quite a big one. So there's vulnerability there. The leaders, they don't want to show vulnerability. And the taking in the good traits kind of help that. Time takes longer to unpack the psychological and physiological capacity for self-compassion. And the challenge for those that, want to take self-responsibility. We live in a society in the West where overworking can get a badge of honor. So that was tricky. Is it suitable for all male leaders? Perhaps not, depends on their style. A wider study would be important. Did it continue afterwards? I'm not sure. I have been meeting the two participants and we've been talking, but I do think the expressions of fierce and tender offer a promising gender-specific lens to address some of the issues around stress, self-care and wellness, and compassionate leadership. Thank you.